Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And today, specifically, what we are looking at is the ongoing media coverage of the conflict. And I would have to say, here in the West, this is probably, if not the most, one of the most biased coverages of any conflict in probably close to recorded history. If I were to ask any person who occasionally watches the news here in the United States, if I were to ask them to give me a synopsis of the current conflict, how do you think the Russians are doing? How do you think the Ukrainians are doing? What does the war look like? And I've asked this question. And the feedback that I tend to get is one that portrays the Russian side as almost as some sort of zombieistic foe, meaning that the outside observer, the occasional listener of news, believes that the Russian army is utilizing massive waves of infantry in what could be tantamount to human wave attacks against Ukrainian lines. If I ask, what do you think the losses of Russia versus Ukraine, what does that look like? And that question is usually answered somewhere in the neighborhood of 10-1, meaning the casual observer here in the West believes that 10 Russian soldiers are being killed and wounded to every one Ukrainian. If I ask, what is your perception of the Russian military? The feedback I get here in the West is they are incompetent. They are not very well trained. They are poorly led, poorly motivated, lack supplies, lack good equipment. If I ask the opinion of the Ukrainian army, I usually get just the opposite. The Ukrainian army is incredibly competent, highly trained, highly motivated. They're defending their homeland. Who do you think is winning the war? The Ukrainians are absolutely winning the war, is the usual comment I get back. And now these are, again, not deep conversations. They're just surface level conversations. But it gives me a good idea of what people are thinking about the war. Now, again, when I say this is probably the most biased conflict, the most one-sided way in which it's covered, is true. But now the question is that helping the Ukrainians? Let's say you're a Ukrainian supporter, and you are getting this information flow, again, that makes you believe, again, the Russians are losing, the Russians are incompetent, the Russians are, in fact, inherently evil. Does that help the Ukrainian side when it is absolutely false? It does not. Have the Russians made mistakes tactically, strategically in this conflict? Yes. Have the Ukrainians made mistakes? Yes, absolutely. Are the Russians adapting to the current battlefield? Absolutely. You don't hear that in the mainstream media. There are a lot of things that are happening on the front lines, not just the front lines, deep behind Ukrainian lines, that are not being talked about by the Ukrainian side. All information that is coming out of this war is doctored. There are things that are happening right now, both strategically and at a tactical level, that the Ukrainians do not want to get out, as do the Russians. But more importantly, as this war has continued to be covered, we hear very, very little about what the Russians are doing right. Now, why is that a problem? Why is it, if you only speak as if the Ukrainians are infallible, are military juggernauts that are defeating the Russian army en masse, when it's not true? Why is that harmful? Well, I can tell you. If you are a Ukrainian conscript or volunteer in Western Ukraine, and again, this does trickle down to those recruits, those conscripts, those getting ready to join the Ukrainian military. And they are going into this fight believing that their enemy is utterly corrupt and utterly incompetent, and thus they must be a walkover. And now what's happening is these Ukrainian forces, these young Ukrainian men and sometimes women, as they get to the front line, as they start to understand what a 20,000 round artillery attack along the front line feels like, what they think or what they thought initially about this war, and then what their belief is now about this war radically changes. If you were to go to the front lines right now in the eastern Donbass and have the ability to actually freely interview Ukrainian army personnel, free of minders and public affairs officers, filters, you're going to hear something radically different than what the news media, the Ukrainian state, is telling you. By and large, here in the U.S., the mass media goes along with what the Ukrainian side says. There is very little investigative reporting about what is actually happening on the front lines. And again, if you were to watch any mainstream news channel here in the United States, you would see that they cover it with an extreme Ukrainian bias, again, meaning the Russians are brainless, mindless zombie orcs being killed in waves. And that's not what's happening. There are some incredibly competent Russian combat units in the field right now that are killing hundreds of Ukrainian army personnel per day. Now, again, in the Western press, that tends to gravitate towards, well, there's a few thousand Wagner fighters that are fairly competent and fairly well trained that are probably Russia's best units. That's not true. Are there highly competent Wagner units made up of ex-Russian Spetsnaz and VDV formations? Yeah, absolutely, and they are competent. But there are also existing Russian field formations, regular army formations, VDV formations, National Guard formations, other formations that are incredibly competent and are giving the Ukrainians just as good as they are getting from the Ukrainians. Don't hear much about that, though, at all. And again, what we're hearing, when you remove the filter, when you remove the propagandized filter, we are learning that the Ukrainian military is in not very good shape right now. It is teetering. It is having significant issues in this war. And they are right now just holding on. Right now. Have the Ukrainians mounted some very effective operations? They have. As in war, each side will have its day. The earlier operation in which, let's say, that the Ukrainians retook areas near Izum and Kharkov, that was a fairly effective operation. Did the Ukrainians take significant casualties? They did. So much so that they could not continue on with operations east and southeast of Kharkov. In the southwest, Kherson. What on the surface appears to be a very effective Ukrainian operation in taking the western bank of the Dnieper River was in fact a strategic withdrawal by Russian forces in which they withdrew about 20 to 30,000 very capable forces across the Dnieper River, saved most of their equipment, meaning the Russians, their equipment, moved that equipment from the western bank of the Dnieper River to the eastern bank. Now, did the Ukrainians, were they effectively able to take control of Kherson and liberate this area? Yes, they were. But there was no mass surrender of Russian forces. At the onset of this operation by the Ukrainians, as the Russians started to withdraw back across towards the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, there was a lot of discussion about some sort of mass surrender of Russian forces. And that didn't happen. Very few Russian prisoners were taken in that Russian operation in which they withdrew from the western bank of the Dnieper River to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. The ongoing offensive by the Ukrainian military in some of these areas, along the northern quadrant of the conflict zone and the western quadrant, the Ukrainians took incredible amounts of casualties. Again, so much so that renewed offensive operations by the Ukrainian army stopped. Didn't happen. And now, again, we're seeing this really a hodgepodge of different types of warfare that are now taking place in the east. Again, the ability of the Ukrainians to maneuver has been greatly degraded compared to, let's say, 6 months ago. So what the Ukrainians are doing now are, for the most part, defensive operations along the front. Now, the problem with it, these are fixed defensive positions in which the Russians are just pounding the living hell out of these Ukrainian fixed defensive positions. Now, the problem for the Ukrainians is going to be later this year. I've talked about this before. When we get into the late summer, that Russian army is going to look different. It's going to perform different. It's going to have different capabilities. Interesting point of fact I wanted to quickly talk about is there has been some discussion about the deployment of, let's say, the MTLB, the battle tractor, the Russian battle tractor, with that strange post-World War anti-aircraft gun sitting on the top. And there has been a lot of question as to the question why. Well, I think people are looking too deep into that. And it's much more simple than asking the question why, but the question why not. What is better, a MTLB with no larger caliber anti-aircraft gun, or a MTLB with a large caliber anti-aircraft gun? And my thought is that those MTLBs that we're seeing right now with those with that elevated turret that you see was probably manufactured in Donetsk or Luhansk by local forces of the Russian separatist forces, or some other small manufacturing facility that had acquired dozens of these MTLBs and were tinkering around with ways to give them more firepower. That's it. And they did. They said, okay, here are these MTLBs. We want to add additional firepower to these MTLBs. Don't look at that as being something that it is not, that the Russians are so short on equipment that they had to resort to the arming of these MTLBs. Again, in all probability, these were just extra on-hand MTLBs in which they said, hey, we have these MTLBs. We also have these aging anti-aircraft systems. Is it possible to put these two together? Again, it's a very small piece of the ongoing war that suddenly has become something much, much bigger than what it really is. But again, think about this rationally. Would you be rather engaging an MTLB with only a light machine gun, or would you rather be engaging an MTLB with a heavy autocannon? And that answer is you probably would not want to be engaging a upgunned MTLB. But that's what's happening. But again, a very, very small piece of this conflict. The same as with the T-62s. The T-62s that we are seeing deployed, in all probability, had already been upgraded and were prepped to be sold and used by another nation state, maybe the Syrians, maybe the Iranians, maybe who knows. And instead of sending those off, they, meaning the Russians, have decided to keep those tanks. So is it better to have a tank or not have a tank? If you have an available tank crew that you're training, and you have the opportunity to put them into an upgraded T-62, are you going to put them in that system, or are you going to wait for another system? Of course, that's what you're going to do, and that's what's happening. At the same time, we know the Russians are continuing to produce and upgrade T-90s, T-90Ms, T-80s, T-72 Bravo 3s, Bravo 3Ms. Still happening. The only question right now in terms of the Russian tank fleet, I would say at this point, is the Armata, the T-14 Armata. And it sounds like that system is still having some challenges and bugs being worked out of it. And the Russian General Staff at this point simply does not feel that they have enough crews that are trained to operate the tank and are trained to have the tank to continually operate in the field effectively. But that's where we're at for today. We will continue to monitor. We will continue to report. We are watching, again, very close to what's happening in and around Bakhmut. Again, pitched battles are continuing, and we anticipate that things could change on the ground rather significantly in the next few days, if not weeks. Again, thanks for joining us. More to come. Have a good day.